Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm talking about overcoming estrogen dominance with my guest Magdalena Wszelaki. So for those who don't know, Magdalena is the founder of Hormones Balance, an online community dedicated to helping women to rebalance their hormones naturally. Magdalena is a certified nutrition coach, herbalist, a published best-selling cookbook author, speaker and educator. She's got a long history of hormonal challenges. Her health crisis was the direct result from a highly stressful life in advertising, starting with Graves' and Hashimoto's disease, both autoimmune conditions causing thyroid failure, to adrenal issues and estrogen dominance. Today, she is in full remission, lives a symptom-free life, and teaches women how to find their sacred hormone balance with her books, online programs, and education. So welcome to the podcast, Magdalena.
Thank you so much for having me. Very
You're
exciting.
welcome. Yeah, I'm excited to chat about estrogen dominance today. We were speaking before we hit record, and I said how I've mentioned that term in pretty much every podcast episode that I do because it's such a huge problem these days, and especially the ladies listening, they've probably got some degree of estrogen dominance. But I want you to talk a little bit more to start off with your health journey. You can take as long as you want because I know it's probably lots of ups and downs, and I'm particularly interested in hearing your struggles with both thyroid conditions, because I think most commonly Hashimoto's, the underactive version, is what most people have, but you don't really commonly hear people of having both Graves' and Hashimoto. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, since you mentioned that, I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's in 2008 and Graves' 7 years prior to that. And we often talk about our health journey from the time we were diagnosed. The truth is that all of that probably started way, way earlier, and it's just never been addressed, and it's finally manifested in the form of an autoimmune disease, right? But so when I think about it, anything from the time I was born to a highly stressful mom, very difficult birth, but also in having not being a breastfed baby, because my mom was one of those in the 70s subscribed to the nurse's advice of giving me formula right away instead of being breastfed. And not surprisingly, I've had food sensitivities ever since I was a baby. And and that back then they'll manifest in the form of a lot of very weak immune system. I was already in a hospital in the first month with pneumonia, and they put me on broad spectrum antibiotics, to having later eczema. And as I grew into my 20s and 30s, it became cystic acne, severe PMSs. And the interesting thing is that, my sister, for example, was born 2 years later, and my mom knew better by then and did breastfeed her. And my sister never had any of these food sensitivity problems the way I did. So, I think the most profound moment for me came when I think about it now is when I had cystic acne. So I was covered literally everywhere here. I still have scars. I had it on my chest, I had it on my back, I had it on my butt. And I grew up in a tropical country. I grew up in Malaysia, where I was there from like age 15 till I was 32. So, you wear summer clothes all year long, right? And so you imagine like having to be fully covered up just to deal with that embarrassment and shame of that, and especially when you're just a young woman being really embarrassed by it. And I remember one of my friends was getting married, also her maid of honor, and she designed this dress for me, and it was all, you can imagine, open here, open back, right? And I said, there's no way I'm gonna be wearing this. She's like, just put on makeup and it's all gonna be good. And the thing with cystic acne, right, for those of you who have it, that you can cover it sort of on the face, but on the back and the front, first of all, you sweat. Number two is like you see these little volcanoes all over your skin. It's terrible. And I thought, what, as a 20-something-year-old, I should not be having zits. Like, this just doesn't make sense. And that's what led me towards the path of discovering food sensitivities. And in my case, it was gluten, dairy, eggs that were causing all of that acne. And when I got off those foods and started doing what I didn't know back then, what we now call the elimination diet, right? Eliminating the highly inflammatory foods. Not only my skin improved significantly, but my energy levels went up. I didn't have those afternoon slumps anymore. My PMSs got a lot better. And I had these migraines from hell where I would never leave the house without a painkiller. And if I did, I had heart palpitations because I'm like, what if I get a headache and I can't? It wasn't even headaches, well, migraines. So, I think that was this early start of that. But I will tell you, when I look at my photos back from Malaysia when I was like 15, 16 years old, I'm in a yard in school, and I'm wearing like this sweater like the way I'm wearing right now, right? Except it's a tropical country. It's hot as hell. Why am I wearing during the day? It wasn't in the evening, right? Why am I wearing a full-on sweater? And the answer is because I already was having problems with my thyroid. So I think that autoimmune component started way, way earlier than I realized. And and I think with hormones is probably it's not going to surprise anyone when I say your hormones don't just fail like that. Like one day you wake up and like your period is difficult, and you've got depression and you got terrible pains, and suddenly endometriosis shows up. It's years of doing things unconsciously that that leads to that point. So I was diagnosed with Graves in late 20s, and then put on thyroid blockers, as you would, right? Wasn't addressing the autoimmune component at all. Didn't change my diet too much back then. And then it came back with a vengeance in 2008. I was then diagnosed with Hashimoto. So I was super lucky to be diagnosed that quickly, because as you, I'm sure, covered with your audience, like thyroid conditions are one of the most underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed conditions. And women struggle so much with that. So I was really lucky and I was diagnosed based on the fact that I was severely exhausted. It was an exhaustion you just could not describe. It wasn't just a fatigue. I started having anxiety attacks, which I had never had before. I'm an intense like type A personality, but I'm not like, anxiety is not part of my makeup. Like I'm always kind of confident and I know where I'm going. Suddenly I started having a lot of doubts, and my mood swings were from hell. And so combine that with estrogen dominant symptoms, so having PMSs from hell, started realizing I'm having a lot of lumps on my breast. Then I went and get my thyroid scanned, and I had thyroid nodules, another symptom of estrogen dominance, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. So that was a real big wake up moment. And this was a time when I was living in China, in Shanghai, with a very stressful job. I used to work in advertising as a strategic planner, a very glamorous job of being in a different country every week. My friends used to call me and ask me, I'm not going to ask you, how are you? I'm going to ask you, where are you? And I thought that was really fun to say that. But after 2 years, it kind of got really tiring, where you suddenly realize, you're putting your body through airport food, hotel food, drinking water from plastic bottles, not sleeping enough. You are the person on a Sunday night taking a flight somewhere, in Asia, right? And to be ready for the Monday presentation, being overworked, but also being a semi-professional athlete. So I would like arrive, say, at a hotel at say 7, 8 p.m. on a Sunday. I'll still go into the gym and like work out till 9 p.m. right? And then only go to bed. So it was just, when I think about it now, I'm like,
I'm stressed just listening to that.
Right? and we're still, it's like, I used to joke and say that I'll sleep when I die, because living in Shanghai was so exciting, and I had so many incredible friends, and there was always so many things to do and parties to go to, and and train for some next event, competition and stuff. So it was, I think my body paid the price. So I think 2008, after the diagnosis with Hashimoto's, I didn't know back then I had estrogen dominance. The diagnosis was just for Hashimoto's. I'm just, reflecting on it now. It's pretty clear I had screaming symptoms. And that's really what I think was a big wake-up moment for me to change my lifestyle. I quit my job. I moved to the United States. I went to school for that. Went to nutrition school, later became an herbalist, and started doing a lot of things for myself, just realizing that, like this is not going to go away unless I really make some significant changes. And so it was interesting, because I didn't have the knowledge that I have now, but I did surrender to this intuition, this little voice that was telling me that even though we sold the agency in China and I was walking away from 70% of my payout, which I had worked for 10 years for, and it's when you sell the agency, there was a big chunk of money to be paid out over a course of 2 years. And I just collected the first 30%. And I thought, whatever I'm going to earn out in the 70%, that I'm walking away from now is probably what I'll have to pay my medical bills later, because I was so sick. Mm-hmm. So that was then. And over the past course of 10 years, reversed Hashimoto's, never had Graves again. I started really working hard. I would say I've been doing this for the past decade, but estrogen dominance probably became a real passion in the past 5 years, especially when I started having hair loss, and my thyroid was in a perfectly good shape, and I didn't have any other symptoms. So I was like, why am I having a hair loss? And I was again super lucky to see a functional doc here in the US, and she tested my estrogen metabolites, and they were just outrageously high on the problematic metabolites, I call it dirty estrogens, that were causing the hair loss. And that also explained why I was having so many problems with my thyroid nodules and lumpy breasts and terrible PMSs, and always having swollen fingers and limbs, couldn't take my rings off, right? Terrible mood swings, all of that was suddenly coming together. So I decided to really focus on estrogen dominance because, as we're going to talk about the symptoms, it's like, you tell me, do you actually know a single woman in your life or you yourself who hasn't suffered from any of the symptoms? There's almost no woman in a developed country wouldn't have some degree of estrogen dominance, yet so few people talk about it. Even so few of my colleagues, practitioners, really truly understand what to do with estrogen dominance as a condition. So I decided there was time to really bring it out and create a platform to talk about it.
Yeah, it's really important, and people might hear the term high estrogen or estrogen, and they're just thinking of things like breast cancer, and that's really important that you kind of get things under control now to affect your future health and disease risk. But it's all of these other symptoms that people just brush off as being normal or part of being a woman. So the PMS, feeling like a different person half of the month, debilitating cramps and pains and migraines, just because they've got a strong family history of those things or their friends are complaining about it, it doesn't mean that they're normal. But with the symptoms, so you've listed many symptoms, and I'm sure there's a ton more, but should these, when it comes to estrogen dominance, are these symptoms all month long present, or is it just at certain times of the cycle that they flare up?
I mean, some of them, like, having thyroid nodules or having less lumpy breasts, that can be there throughout the cycle, right? So, having hair loss. Should we go through the symptoms maybe just to wrap it up? So, for women who are still menstruating, I mean, any kind of menstruation problems, whether you've got heavy periods, like you're bleeding 20 days out of a year, whether you're having incredibly painful periods, you are in a fetal position. That was me, in a fetal position for 2 days, like a day before your period or first 2 days of your period, right? And you can function without some significant painkillers, whether it's your period is sporadic or just shows up whenever, right? So, any of those, or mid-cycle spotting is another possibility of estrogen dominance. That's all very correlated with issues with estrogen. And then if you have a lot of other things, so we talked about thyroid nodules, but also hypothyroidism is very correlated. A lot of women who have estrogen dominance also have low thyroid function, and that's because estrogen binds up as a thyroid hormone, so that's part of the reason. But you also have things like fibroids, right? How many women in developed countries, whether it's UK or US, lose their uteruses because of fibroids? Endometriosis, which is one of the most painful conditions one woman can experience, is also fueled by inflammation, but also estrogen dominance, and having excess estrogen also is inflammatory, right? So it's definitely a huge contributing factor. Uterine polyps, another thing that a lot of women are diagnosed with, can be due to estrogen dominance. We kind of alluded to mood swings. I mean, they can be, like you said about PMS, like we are told as women is part of the deal, right? Of being a woman. Same thing, like every guy has a joke, right? About his girlfriend or wife having that time of a month and like really losing it on him. And first I want to establish that when we're going through a cycle, it's normal, because when you look at what your hormones do during that time, it's normal that you have time when you're really open and vivacious and outgoing, and you got like a lot of creative ideas, and you want to connect with people, and at times when you really want to be by yourself, and that's okay. It's just a question of, you want to be by yourself in a fetal position, depressed and having suicidal thoughts and being pissed off at the whole world and biting off people's heads, or are you just quietly being there, introverted by yourself? There's a difference in those, right? And it doesn't have to be that drastic picture that I've just drawn. And, you know, having mood swings, I mean, as much as it's a joke in our society, the truth of the matter is that they can be hugely compromising of our relationships, you know, with our employers, with our colleagues, with the people that we love the most. And you come out of that and you're like, that's not the person that's not who I am, you know, in a core, right? But it's just the hormones that can really, you know, go crazy. So another interesting one, I think, when it comes to, you know, estrogen dominance, is where we store fat is an indication also of hormonal problems. So women, you know how we call women pear-shaped and apple-shaped, right? So apple-shaped are those women who store a lot of fat around their tummy, and that tends to be more metabolic related. So like high testosterone, high blood sugar levels, high inflammation, right? Women, well, guess what? Women who are highly estrogenic, so that would, for example, be me. If I put on weight, it goes straight into my butt, it goes into my thighs, and it's not just fat, but it's also cellulite. And the thing is that, you know, you have women who exercise like 5 times a week. They go to the gym and they just can't lose that weight, right? And it's like, what's going on here? And that creates this incredible frustration and disappointment and kind of like obsessive, you know, exercise behavior. And the truth is, then, unless you correct the estrogen dominance component, it's going to be really hard to lose weight there. So I would say, you know, and so those are the main ones. And the last one I'll just mention, you know, which is more for mature women issues. But I think that was, you know, a big thing for me to really, I think, address estrogen dominance very seriously, is the estrogenic cancers that can result from years of having estrogen dominance. So those would be, the most common one is breast cancer. This is the leading form of cancer amongst breast cancer patients. And, you know, and so things like that, what like Angelina Jolie had with double mastectomy and all that, those are like genetic cancers that are a lot more rare as compared to the estrogen receptor positive form of breast cancer, as well as ovarian, uterine cancer, thyroid cancer. And lastly, one of the fastest growing cancers now too is lung cancer in non-smokers. So suddenly a person goes like, why am I having lung cancer when I never smoked? My mom never smoked. Like, where did it come from? It can be estrogenic. So, you know, the part of, just to add on to, like we were talking a little bit about this history before, you know, one of the ways of knowing that you have a tendency towards being more estrogenic, right? And that can be very correlated with your genetics. And so one of the big realizations that I had was when I looked at both sides of my family, I have estrogenic cancer deaths on both sides, my mom's side and my dad's side. And you're talking about ovarian, uterine, and breast cancer in all 3 categories, right? So that was a huge aha moment for me, you know. And all my aunts, by the way, had the uteruses removed like in their 40s and 50s already, right? And then they ended up dying from another form of cancer later, which kind of is an interesting point too, right? Like removing a uterus because you have a big fibroid is not going to solve the problem. You're not addressing estrogen dominance. It's just going to manifest in some other way. And so what are you going to do? Remove the thyroid, remove the breast, remove the uterus, remove the ovaries, right? Just to prevent it from happening. It's crazy, right? So so that was a huge motivator for me as well. And, you know, I would say, like, if you have estrogenic cancers, like I mentioned, running on both sides of the family, and in the early stages, like as a young woman, you're showing a lot of signs of estrogen dominance, I'll say, do something about it now.
It's never too early to begin, because the choices that you make now and the status of your health currently, it's going to affect things like cancers can take 20, 30 years to develop. So like you said, they don't just pop up overnight. You don't just develop cancer out of the blue. It's been manifesting for years, if not decades.
Absolutely.
I believe with any hormone, they're very, like, I call them like Goldilocks hormones. They need to be just right in order for us to feel great. And estrogen dominance is way more common, I think, than low estrogen, but I think we should touch on maybe a few symptoms of low estrogen and how that can be just potentially as problematic when it comes to symptoms.
Yeah, so low estrogen is when you start typically going into menopause, right? So it's associated with a lot of the symptoms. However, I do see that in more and more young women too, starting to experience that. So low estrogen will manifest in the form of having hot flashes, having a lot of memory issues. Your periods are very irregular, infertility problems, having cognitive function issues. Estrogen is also super important in cardiovascular health in women, but also in our bone building. We think about calcium as a bone builder, which is like one of the many things that are required, right? And guess what? Estrogen, progesterone are both hormones that one builds, the other one fills in all the different compounds into the bone. So those are some of the symptoms. And you can be low on estrogen and still have estrogen dominant symptoms. And the reason why that happens is because the way you break down. So let me just actually step back a little bit, because I think this is important information to know. First of all, I don't want to demonize estrogen, because we need it as women, right? You wouldn't have a butt and a period and be a woman if you didn't have sufficient levels of estrogen. You won't be able to sleep and function and think. You wouldn't be listening to this podcast if you had no estrogen. So that is not the problem. It's not the overall amount of estrogen that is the issue. The biggest issue is, it kind of goes back to the two forms of estrogen that are present, that can occur, and they can both be present at the same time. The biggest one is what I call the clean and dirty estrogens. So how your body breaks down estrogens to clean estrogens or protective estrogens, right? That actually do the work and make you feel good, right? Versus the dirty estrogens that are probably causing problems like the symptoms that we talked about earlier. So, and guess what? The breakdown of those estrogens happens in the liver, right? So that's like a big aha moment for a lot of women, realizing that, to fix my estrogen, I actually need to work on my liver and my gut. And really those are the primary focus areas. The second way estrogen dominance can happen is when you have too little progesterone as compared to estrogen. And these two are like two dancing partners. If you see a dance competition and if one partner is overly enthusiastic and animated and overdressed and the other one is kind of shy and quiet, it doesn't look good, and this couple is never going to win anything, right? So with estrogen and progesterone is the same thing. And so having an adequate amount of these two is vital. So going back to what we talked about, low estrogen levels, right? So when you start having low estrogen levels, why can it be that you still have estrogen dominance? Because even though you're low, the way you're breaking them up is unfavorable, and even though the both of them dropped, estrogen, progesterone dropped, your progesterone is still a lot lower than estrogen. So that explains, we have a quiz on my website, and on a regular basis, we get emails from people saying, your quiz sucks. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It says I'm estrogen dominant, yet I'm low on estrogen. And even though we explain it, that you can be both, I think most people don't really read in detail, and so they kind of jump into conclusions. But yes, it's absolutely possible.
Yeah, I say that all the time. And I have people coming to me saying, I've had my estrogen checked, everything's good, but they still have all of the symptoms. They're obviously estrogen dominance, but it's because the progesterone just isn't keeping up. So in terms of testing, would you just go off symptoms, or are there any good tests that you would recommend to check estrogen, but also the metabolization? Because I agree that that's just as, if not more important.
Yeah, that's an important question, right? And I don't know what testing is available in the UK, but I would just say, regardless where you are, conventional doctors, OBGYNs, like when you go in there and say, look, my period hasn't come back in 3 months, or whatever issue you're having, right? They will test your hormones, your estrogen, progesterone through blood, through serum, and that's completely useless. Doesn't show you anything. When I was in private practice back in the day, I will have women, and you probably see the same thing, women coming in with test results, having screaming symptoms of estrogen dominance, having fibroids, having missing periods, can't get pregnant, right? And she shows me the results, and it says that she's in perfect health, hormones wise, right? So blood is completely useless for steroid hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, DHEA, testosterone. They're great for other things like thyroid. Your thyroid hormones are great. Your blood sugar levels, all these other ones, yes, but not steroid hormones. So I do believe that if you are just having lingering symptoms of estrogen dominance, you don't have a lot of budget to spend on testing. In the United States, none of it is covered, right? So it's out of pocket kind of a thing. And then going by symptoms and just journaling and writing out what are you feeling, how are you feeling, and then implementing those protocols that that I teach, right? And it's nothing weird or difficult to do. It's just like, hopefully we get to talk about this, but it's really pretty no nonsense, simple stuff that you can just modify some things in your diet. But then, for some people need like, I do believe that people who should test are people who wouldn't take action unless they have the proof, the proof is there in front of them. They need something and they want to do that before and after. Like they want to see that before they change the diet, they want to see that after, and that only motivates them to make changes. Then you know yourself. If that's you, then go and test. And then the other form of testing I recommend is for women who have a history of estrogenic cancers, or you have a rampant family history of estrogenic cancers. Then I would highly recommend testing. And the testing that I like the most is urine testing. So are you guys able to order Dutch in the UK? Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome. So that's my favorite kind of testing. What I like about it is that shows you a lot of different things, but the biggest one, since we're on estrogen dominance, is how your body breaks down to those dirty and clean estrogens, if you will. And whether you have the genetic components to it, then that it doesn't code for, basically you don't detoxify of estrogens very easily. And then based on that, you might, you're going to learn what are the things that you can add, some supplements or diet in order to switch that balance. The other one, what is unfortunate about Dutch testing is that their progesterone markers are just, it's an estimate. It's not an actual number. So I wish there was a test 2-in-1. So for progesterone, I do like saliva testing. I find that to be accurate, and I like that. But saliva testing doesn't show you the metabolites. So there's pros and cons to two of them. But either way, they are still better than the blood testing.
And you're probably the same as me. I have people coming to me because they know that I run the Dutch test, and I have a whole, if anyone's interested in that, I have a whole episode with Dr. Carrie Jones, who's the medical director of Precision Analytical. I think it's number 25, so it's right back at the beginning, but a really good in-depth episode. I have people coming to me just wanting to run a Dutch test, and I always tell them, we can if you really want to, if you're a data-driven person, but I'd rather you spend that £300 or $300 on treatment than getting a test that's just going to confirm my suspicions already. We can just tell off symptoms that you're going to probably have high cortisol levels, your melatonin's probably going to be low, your estrogen's going to be high, and progesterone's going to be lower. So it's just going to confirm everything, and I'd rather you put that money, especially if there's a budget that we need to work with. We might as well just see how we get on for a few months, do the basics that we were going to do anyway, and then if necessary, and you're still symptomatic at that point, then we could go in with a test and see where we're at in terms of a baseline. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I do. I will add, just to reemphasize, for people who have a history of breast cancers, I do suggest to test every 6 months to a year, at least once a year, just to make sure that you have things really in really good check. And so there's no recurrence of that. But otherwise, I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Being proactive rather than reactive and waiting until something happens, waiting until you get a diagnosis. We don't want to do that. Yeah. And with treating estrogen dominance, there's two schools of thought. So either like just push down estrogen, just reduce and take things like DIM and calcium D-glucarate to lower the estrogen levels. But then there's the other people who are saying we just need to boost progesterone. So we just need to match kind of the levels of the two. I personally do a little bit of both, especially if the metabolites are really high in the bad type. What do you say with that?
Yeah, so, same as you, I actually like doing both. That's why, in my latest book, Overcoming Estrogen Dominance, we do have some foods that are phytoestrogen, that do contain phytoestrogen, such as flaxseed, for example, or drinking, that's what I'm drinking right now, red raspberry tea. And so that's something that is also, it has an estrogenic effect. That is, adding estrogens through food or through herbs, it's not the problem. It's if anything, like for somebody who's going through perimenopause, like myself, like I actually want those phytoestrogens in my life, right, to bring those estrogen levels up. The issue is how you break them down. That is the bigger issue. And so So again, it goes back to the health of the liver and the gut, because that's where the breakdown happens of estrogen. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's and.
And with the phytoestrogens, a big debatable subject is soy. Where are you? So we'll mainly with my audience, the premenopausal. So let's say from 18 to 35, that's kind of the age range of this my audience. With those people, let's say that they're dealing with estrogen dominance, so they're not near menopause at this point. Do you think soy and these phytoestrogens are a good thing? Because again, some people say that they increase estrogen and they just make things worse, whereas there's other people say that it actually lowers the bad types of estrogen.
Yeah.
I know there's studies and things done on both sides.
Exactly. So that's exactly true. And that is the confusing part on, when you see studies that show both, right, that they can help and they can worsen symptoms. Here's an interesting thing is that when those studies are conducted, I've reached out to a couple of those institutions that conducted them, asking them to disclose what kind of soy they've used. Was it a non-GMO soy, like an organic soy, or was it a GMO-based soy, right? And I never heard back from any of them. This is like one of the most frustrating things is like, unless maybe you're a professor at Harvard, like they don't really respond to you. And so I think that's the one big part of that. The other thing with soy, so my simple answer is I stay away from it just because of the negative studies that do exist. And I feel like we can find safe phytoestrogens in other foods and herbs that doesn't have to carry that what if happens. The other thing with soy is that not all soy is made the same, right? If you have soy in the form of, things like soy milk or tofu, which is highly processed, or God forbid, all these soy, meat lookalikes, right, for vegetarians and vegans, I mean, that stuff is just pure toxic. But if you talk about stuff like tempeh, a fermented form of soy, right, that comes in a natural form that's not processed in any way, and the fermentation is what preserves the soy, then it's a different food altogether, right? So I'll say if somebody doesn't have a problem with soy, then having things like the soy sauce or having soy in the form of tempeh, that's perfectly fine. But I will stay away from things like soy milk, all the soy-like products, meat-like products, even silken tofu. I mean, someone who grew up, like I grew up in Asia, right? And let me tell you, when you go to the markets, they make the soy overnight, right? And then you go there and they have these big pots, and then they scoop out the soy tofu into a container. If you don't eat it by the end of the day, it's gonna go bad. If you don't eat it, then you put it in the fridge. If you don't eat it by the following day from the fridge, it's gonna go bad. That's how quickly it goes bad. And so imagine the amount of preservatives you also need to put in there in order to preserve it, right? So there is an element of that too. And soy milk is just nasty altogether. So I would just stay away from that. So generally, I would say there's so many other interesting foods to explore that, just like let it go.
Not risk soy just while it's a bit of an uncertain thing at the moment. But interesting you brought up like the Asian population. They have lower levels of things like breast cancer, and things like soy have been kind of claimed to help with that. Are there any other lifestyle habits or dietary things that they do that you think could be contributing to lower levels of estrogen and breast cancer risk?
Well, mind you, that is changing. Okay. So, it's things like hot flashes. So like things like menopause was unknown in Japan, for example, for generations. But it's pretty commonplace now. And so in China, I spent so much time living in China. These things are changing now, right? So, but why did it not have a problem before? I mean, I think it's a combination of things, which isn't one thing. It's everything from, there was no going out. I mean, even if you were going out, it was a grandma who was cooking on the side of the road, right? So it was all home cooked food. Every Chinese family has a grandma. It's a very communal living. So you live with your family, you live with your parents, like something that in Western countries we don't do. So grandma is always there cooking, right? Or the mom is always cooking. So it was always freshly cooked food. Hardly ever heated up the following day. Talk about histamines, right? It's always fresh food that came from the markets, very little processed foods. I think their stress levels were very different from what they are here, right? I mean, the list just goes on. The kind of products that we used to use was a lot more natural versus the xenoestrogens, like the, skincare products, the lotions and all that we use from mainstream brands today, right? I mean, that's a huge source of xenoestrogens as well, those dirty estrogens, if you will, right? So, it's, I think it's a whole combination of things.
And what are your thoughts on animal protein? So there's the obvious quality difference as well, but there's some people with endometriosis who are told they need to go plant-based, they need to go vegan, because just the natural growth hormones found in meat, even like grass-fed beef, is causing inflammation, and things like dairy products have insulin-like growth factors in there and obvious estrogen from the animal. Are you kind of somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I am somewhere in the middle. So first of all, don't go and buy. So dairy, I'm absolutely off. I do recommend to be off dairy unless you identify that dairy is something you can have occasionally and it doesn't affect you. Then having like a good, Parmigiano Reggiano, or having a good burrata or whatever. Although I prefer like hard cheeses and then it's fine. But especially if you're doing the elimination diet at first, you really want to stay out of dairy for the whole time. Now about meat, it's I mean, some of the unhealthiest people I've met when I was in private practice were vegans, right? So just because you're vegan, it doesn't guarantee you that you get. But to your point about like growth hormones or antibiotics that being to an animal, I think solution is pretty simple. Just go and buy meat from your farmer who doesn't do that, right? It's a grass-fed animal from farmers markets, and then people a lot of times push back and say, yeah, but I can't afford it, it's expensive. And I'll say, you don't have to have a lot of it, just scale back on your meat, right? It's really as simple as that. Part of the reason why I don't like women, or I don't advocate 100% plant-based diet, I do advocate a 70 to 80% plant-based diet. So like whenever I have a meal, I always look at my plate and I look at it and say, how much vegetables do I have in here versus the amount of meat I don't go there and weigh and stuff, because I think that's just obsessive behavior. But it's just looking at your plate, and part of the reason why I do like animal protein in the diet of women is because so many people are suffering from blood sugar balance problems. And really animal protein, especially having some first thing in the morning, I'm a big advocate of breakfasts that are high in proteins, fat, and fiber. I call it PFF kind of breakfast, and not loaded with carbohydrates and fruits, right? Things like fruit and oatmeal. And I mean, that's what we eat as Westerners, right? So I feel like meat can really help balance that. You might say, well, what about beans, right? I can do a lot of protein and get my proteins and fiber from beans and legumes. And I agree. The issue again is that so many people have such compromised digestive system that they don't tolerate beans very well. Unless you do certain legumes, like for example, lentils, like the yellow lentils are very easy, or red lentils, sorry, are easier to digest. They're quick to cook, but it kind of gets boring after a while, right? So, but generally beans, are harder to digest, and many of us just can't digest them properly. So then what do you do, right? Where do you get your protein from? And most importantly, how do you sustain your blood sugar balance, that you don't go into these hypoglycemic episodes, which are hugely detrimental for your inflammation and your overall hormone balance.
Yeah, you're not going to have balanced hormones if your blood sugar's spiking and crashing all day long. That is a huge stress to the body, particularly the female body. So you need to start there. That's like the number one job of the endocrine system, is to regulate blood sugar. So if you're not doing that properly, it doesn't really care if you have a face full of acne, your hair's falling out, or if your period is MIA. But
yeah.
The reason I'm guessing why your diet is 70 to 80% vegetables is the fiber. And if you're constipated and backed up, then that is a risk factor for estrogen dominance as well. But could you talk a bit more about the gut health and estrogen connection?
So I'll just mention maybe a couple of like two big things. One is constipation, right? So if you're not evacuating properly every day, and I don't mean like just go and have a bit of a bowel movement, but we're talking about a complete bowel movement where you feel emptied, when you have a nice poop that looks like a banana shaped and is in one piece, and it doesn't smell awful, and it doesn't fall apart, it doesn't sink, it doesn't float, sorry, it only sinks. That's when you have a good bowel movement. When you're constipated, what happens is that all these estrogens we talked about get recycled, right? And so that causes a lot of, and not just estrogens, but it's all your heavy metals, right? pesticides, everything gets recycled, and the liver gets hugely taxed having to process them one more time. So that's one big issue. The second issue is there is something really interesting about the bacteria in the gut, right? I mean, we are discovering so much more about the microbiome and its connection to depression, ability to lose weight, and just our overall, well-being and ability to break down histamines and oxalates and all these issues, right? Well, guess what? It turns out there is a subset of bacteria in the gut called the estrobolome. The estrobolome codes for enzymes that break down estrogens. So, and just like a little side note to this, in some ways that it connects, is that when they studied women with breast cancer, there was an interesting correlation, not a causation, but correlation between women with breast cancer and the lack of diversity of their microbiome, which versus, compared to healthy women, right? And it's not about like you just chugging down a lot of probiotics, after listening to this call, but it's really, we're talking about diversity of the microbiome and not just having a lot of the 12, strains that your probiotic might be having. So, and then the other thing I'll mention on that is that, as much as I'm a big fan of flaxseed because it's a phytoestrogen and it really helps to, flaxseed is just so amazing in so many ways. It blocks the receptor for the dirty estrogens to come through, and it gives you natural estrogens, to boost them a little bit, helps you regulate your cycle and all of that good stuff. But, I would say 1 out of 20 women in our community will report back who done, for example, our seed cycling, or just incorporated flaxseed based on my recommendation, will write back and say, it really hasn't worked for me. Like my breasts are really tender. That's another symptom I forgot to mention. Fibrocystic breast, lumpy breast is another symptom, right, of estrogen dominance. And they'll say, my breast just got worse and my PMS got worse. And so obviously the first thing we say is stop, like you don't want to do that. But it fascinated me why there are some women who have this paradoxical response to it. So I went to research, and what I had found is that that they have concluded in this one study that it's your ability of having the right kind of bacteria. And don't hate me for this, but this paper doesn't cite which kind of bacteria, which strain it is. But it's the bacteria that needs to be there in order to break down the lignans. That's what's present, right, in the flaxseed, in order to make them bioavailable for the body and do the estrogenic work the beneficial estrogenic work we talk about. So, so it was really interesting to read this, like, and then when we message women like that saying, do you generally have GI problems, right? The answer is always yes. It's either constipation, they're having a lot of food sensitivities, they have IBS, they've been diagnosed with Hashimoto's, and the list goes on. So there's definitely a correlation between those two. So anyway, you tell me, do you know anyone who's got a messed up digestion and healthy hormones?
No,
because I've never come across.
And that's usually the first place I start, even in people who don't have any obvious, or they don't tell me about any digestive symptoms. Sometimes they think that bloating's normal, and I tell them that it's definitely not. But yeah, sometimes the people who have regular bowel movements, like no bloating, no gas, but terrible periods and terrible endometriosis and autoimmune disease, they often have the worst gut health in terms of infections and parasites and SIBO and low stomach acid. So it's really crazy, and that's definitely the first place to start. And I'm glad that you mentioned the estrobolome, and if you've got some sort of bacterial overgrowth going on, too much bad bacteria, that estrogen is just going to keep recirculating over and over again. And actually, the more that happens, the more toxic and the dirtier, the term that you use, the dirtier the estrogen becomes. So that is a definite risk factor for all of those conditions that we've spoken about.
Absolutely.
Another food group I wanted to ask about was cruciferous vegetables. So I'm personally a big fan, and things like broccoli sprouts, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, because of things like the sulfur in there, they can help with the liver and the fiber, obviously, can be really good for lowering estrogen, particularly the bad types. But there's a lot of debate online. Again, there's a lot of controversy and people contradicting each other. Recently, there's a lot of people hating on cruciferous vegetables, saying how they contain goitrogens, which is obviously true. but that can impair thyroid function and therefore that can increase estrogen levels. But then there's the other people who say that it's going to help with estrogen dominance. I'm on the I'm all for cruciferous vegetables, not overdoing it and definitely not raw in high amounts. But I'm just wondering where you stand on that.
Yeah, I'm completely the same way. And, if you talk to any of the thyroid experts like Dr. Isabella Wenz or Dr. Karazian or Ellen Christensen, they're on the same boat. And you mentioned cruciferous vegetables inhibit the thyroid function. The one that is really showing that is soy, in high amounts that it does. I haven't found studies that actually connect cruciferous vegetables to the thyroid itself. I have anecdotally been told, I remember once I did this talk at this, I used to do a lot of talks when I lived in New York, and a lot of women's groups and co-ops and all the places. And it was, there were people occasionally who come on and say, I went on this health binge and every day I'll do a smoothie with raw kale. And they were talking about like a bunch of kale, right? Every day in a smoothie. And they were convinced they got hypothyroidism right after that. And so I don't want to dismiss it, but you really shouldn't be eating raw kale every day. I mean, I think the Scots will tell you they give kale to the pigs, which is like on the other extreme side of things. But and really sautéing them. Well, let me say this. Before I started working with estrogen dominance, my whole audience and all my patients in the clinic and when I was in private practice back in the day were all Hashimoto's and hypothyroid patients. And let me tell you, I have not met a single one of them who would have said, I've cut out all the cruciferous vegetables and I cured my thyroid. Not a single one of them.
Yeah, I'm the same.
So
if anything, they feel better with 1 or 2 servings a day, lightly cooked, and a range of different types, not just overdoing kale every single day, try and get a range of different ones. I'm exactly the same.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And in terms of like their nutritional profile and density compared to, for example, lettuce, I always, I kind of joke about it, but I'm not saying throw away the goddamn lettuce. Like lettuce has got no nutritional value whatsoever. Zucchinis is another one. Like it's like water, and a tiny bit of fiber. There's really not much in them. Cucumbers also like, substitute that with all the radishes and turnips and all the ones that you mentioned, right? Collard greens. I'm not sure if you guys have that in the UK. And broccoli sprouts, and having those brought into your daily life, that's going to make a difference in your nutritional profile. And as it is, we are already so nutritionally depleted. Our food is not the same what it used to be. When I look at the studies from before the war, 1930, I think it was 1937, on the nutritional content of an apple and potato and whatever, and what we have now is vastly different. I mean, there's like a drop of between 50 to 80% of nutritionally being lower. So, just pick your battles and not pick your battles, but just pick the right food to incorporate. And I'm so much in line with you. And I will say, one of my favorites amongst the crucifers, which I think are very underestimated, are the turnips and the radishes, because they are so pungent that a lot of people just don't like eating them raw. And I completely get that. Kohlrabi, I think, is quite a nice one, although many people don't even know what to do with it, right? Kohlrabi is great. If you see it this summer in the farmer's market, do get it, peel it off, use it as a stick for hummus or, any kind of a dip. It's just a wonderful. 2 things you can do. One is, just slicing them and adding them to your current salads. And even if it's a cooked salad, just having them as raw is perfectly fine. They just add a little bit of a punch. But the other one, which a lot of people don't realize, you can actually roast them. And having them roasted, brings up, they're actually full of sugars, polysaccharides. And so these sugars get caramelized while getting roasted, and they sweeten them, but they still retain their bitter quality. So you have like the sweet bitter elements to it, and they just absolutely are wonderful as roasted.
Yeah, I've done that before as well, and I agree, they're delicious. And I don't eat a lot of turnips or swede or anything like that anymore, but I'm definitely going to expand my palate a little bit more because I want all of the benefits. Are there any other key foods or herbs that you want to talk about, either like culinary herbs or supplemental herbs for lowering estrogen, either the bad types or just overall?
Yeah. So, I think yeah, let's talk about burdock root and dandelion root. That's, since I alluded at the beginning that in order to address estrogen dominance, we really want to address our liver, right? And work through the liver. So, anything that you add that's bitter in flavor is going to tremendously help your liver. So, since I mentioned dandelion, I'll just mention dandelion leaf first. So dandelion leaf has the more of an efficacy of detoxing your kidneys, but the fact itself that it's bitter, it immediately is going to work on your liver. One of my favorite salads, and it's a Tuscan salad in Italy. They use a lot of dandelion leaf. It's a very bitter leaf, but if you toss it with a little bit of orange, use the orange zest with some olive oil and salt as a dressing, add a little bit of maybe sliced fennel to it, right? Or cucumber or whatever, just to kind of even out the balance of it. It's just like basically the orange and the dandelion leaf is just a beautiful combination of bitter meets sweet. And it just is absolutely delightful. But talking about teas, I love dandelion root and burdock root. They're both huge liver movers, but they also are protective towards the liver. So they're protecting your liver from any kind of pesticides or heavy metals that are coming in through food or whatever you're inhaling. And I've had women in our community say that just brewing that tea after a meal, it was like they got addicted to it, right? Meaning like their body started craving it. And the cravings is a fascinating phenomenon, right? Because cravings is like your body communicating with you what needed helps from us, right? And so them craving the bitter after a meal is basically the body saying, what you've been doing for the past 2 weeks, like, I really love it. Give it to me again. The simplest way to do this is like a lot of the health food stores these days are selling liver, liver detox or liver tonic teas. You can get one of those. I personally prefer to use, because I'm an herbalist, maybe, is to get loose herbs and just infuse them yourself, decoct them yourself. Because it's a root, you want to do it a little bit longer, like half an hour or so. Is when you really extract a lot of the polysaccharides that are super helpful. So yeah, so this is some of my absolute favorites. And I'll just mention one more because that's the tea that I'm sipping on here right now. This is red clover, and I think I did a combination of red clover and red raspberry leaf, and both of them are like real wonderful women's tonics. It's funny, we call adaptogens herbs that tend to work more on the HPA and the adrenals, that axis. But I have found that there are some herbs like these ones, depending on what you need, is going to help you. So for example, if you are having terrible PMSs, it's going to help with that. If you're having no periods, it's going to help to regulate the period. So it just brings the attention to what's needed. And it's a wonderful tea. It doesn't taste anything terrible. It doesn't taste anything weird. It just actually tastes kind of like black tea would, so a really nice addition to sip on it every day.
Yeah, and I love nothing more than brewing. I feel like a witch around a cauldron, like throwing in all of these herbs, and I totally adapt it to how I'm feeling that day, where I'm at in my menstrual cycle. So once you start to understand some of the medicinal properties and learning more about your body and the hormones, you can really craft your own herbal blend. And especially the weather, like if anyone's watching on video, Magdalena's background right now is absolutely beautiful. And in the UK, it's winter, it's freezing. So I love nothing more than a nice warm herbal tea. But even if someone's listening in summer, I sometimes just brew them in the morning, let them cool, and then sip on them throughout the day. So you don't have to be drinking hot tea when it's like 90 degrees outside.
Right.
Last two things I wanted to ask your opinion on is caffeine and alcohol. There's again people saying little bits of caffeine and coffee in particular, if it's good quality, it's good for the liver, it's antioxidants. And then alcohol, everyone brings up, I think, resveratrol in red wine. That's like they try to see the benefits, because there's been some studies on resveratrol for anti-aging and antioxidant protection. Specifically for estrogen dominance, is it a yes or no for these things?
Okay, so neither. It's going to be that least favorite answer in that sense, depends. And and so you really wouldn't know until you cut it out and see how your body reacts to it. So let me give you an example. I think caffeinated drinks are not all the same, right? Having a cup of green tea versus having a coffee from a commercial place that's been sprayed with a lot of different chemicals it's a two different animals. It's those two different drinks. They just happen to have caffeine as the connecting denominator, but that's unfair to say. So let me give you an example. I'm generally not a fan of coffee, especially doing, people who are doing like coffee with intermittent fasting. I feel like it messes up women's hormones big time.
Agreed.
Coffee, especially on an empty stomach, does increase your blood sugar levels. So you're basically setting yourself up for hypoglycemia first thing in the morning. I personally found that even if I put a lot of butter to it and whatever fat, it ain't gonna make any difference. It's highly inflammatory. It does inhibit. So yes, it is bitter, so it's supposed to help the liver, but it's also working on a pathway that also detoxifies us from estrogen. So in some ways, you're actually loading up more on your liver to making it work a lot harder. We always talk about in our community, you really wouldn't know how you react to coffee unless you cut it out and then reintroduce it and see how you feel. And a lot of women, it's such a highly addictive substance, right? That a lot of people just find it absolutely impossible to give it up, which is also an indication that the more you are addicted to something, the more you actually need to cut it out.
They'd benefit the most.
Right. So that would be my answer. The other thing is, so let me just tell you, when I drink, and this is, I want to give you an example of caffeine, one drink versus another. If I drink coffee, my whole body smells. I get hypoglycemic. I don't sleep very well. My PMSs are from hell. My body, I literally have body odor. I generally never use deodorants unless I start drinking coffee. And then my moods I just become a really mean person. So obviously it messes up with my neurotransmitters, right? Now, do I get the same thing from matcha tea or from black tea, like a chai tea with no sugar in it? Absolutely not. And so it's two completely different things. And so I do a little bit of caffeine every day. I'll do about a teaspoon of matcha tea, which is an equivalent of an espresso in terms of caffeine content, but always after a meal. If you do coffee or anything caffeinated on an empty stomach, you're basically setting yourself up for glycemia. So that's about that. It's really about just experimenting and figuring out what works best for you. And I will tell you that in our community, when women cut out coffee, their energy goes up, they sleep a lot better, their hormones get a lot more regulated, and this is I'm talking here about coffee also that's organic, that's not sprayed with anything, it's marketed as being, the new type of coffee. And even with that, I don't know what it is in coffee that causes this. I don't think it's the caffeine alone. It's some other compounds that are contributing towards that. Not about alcohol. There's enough studies to show, women who consume more than 5 alcoholic drinks a week have a 27% higher chance of getting breast cancer. So that's something to consider, especially if it's running in your family. But I think it's also, really interesting to figure out for yourself, like what kind of alcohol impacts you the most and how do you feel, right? Having a glass of beer, which is super high in yeast and very high in histamine, might be different from having a shot of tequila, a high quality tequila, right? Now, which time of the day are you doing it could be also making a big difference. For example, one of the things I'm discovering about my own sleep is I'm 48 right now. My sleep is not the same what it used to be. I'm a lot more sensitive to a lot of factors. So I started tracking, what are the things that are really impacting me? And one of the problems with alcohol, you see, is the fact that it really impacts the quality of your sleep. And the closer you drink to the bedtime, the more that it happens. And, and is it alcohol or is it a histamine that causes that, right? Histamine is also another big issue. I don't know whether people are just getting a lot more awareness about histamine in our society, or whether we are just getting so overloaded that just more women are reacting to histamines, or maybe it's a combination of both. I don't know. But I'm hearing from almost everyone now, they're having issues with histamine. They're breaking out in rashes. They've got anxiety attacks. They've got all sorts of skin problems. They can't sleep at night. So, I did an experiment of whether is it alcohol that's impacting me, or is it the histamine in alcohol is it histamine that is impacting me? It turns out it's the histamine. It's because I had yogurt before going to bed, and I woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't go back to sleep until 4, right? So, but alcohol also, there's so many studies showing you how it reduces your deep sleep, and your deep sleep is really where all your recovery happens on a cellular level, including, your growth hormones get produced when you're in deep sleep. And so alcohol impacts that. So I would say, you know, we still want to enjoy life and live. I like the 80-20 rule, where you do 80% of the stuff for good health, and the 20% you have, there are times when you have fun. You know, but if if somebody is making it a habit to have 3 glasses of wine to kind of knock themselves out as a coping mechanism with stress and unhappiness, right, every day, then it's a definite no. And you mentioned about resveratrol, which I would just address this here because I find it kind of funny, and it's just the power of marketing, right? You know, French winemakers found resveratrol in red wine, and so suddenly red wine from France became the shit, right? And so, well, guess what? A bottle of red wine from the Bordeaux province, okay, has got like at the most 2 milligrams of resveratrol. All the studies that are done on resveratrol, including that help with estrogen detoxification that we talked about and skewing them towards the clean estrogens away from dirty ones, are based on 150 to 500 milligrams of resveratrol, right?
Well, just drink 100 bottles of wine, you'll be fine. That's what people are thinking.
So there you have my answer about resveratrol.
Yeah,
and
very good marketing. That's what it is. I have spoken because histamine for me has been a huge factor. And I actually had mast cell activation syndrome. So mine wasn't just like basic high histamine and histamine intolerance. Mine like exceeded that. But I do have a whole, if anyone's interested and doesn't really know what we're talking about, episode 78 with Beth O'Hara. It's on histamine and mast cells and all of that. So definitely go and check that out.
Yeah, Beth is amazing.
Yeah, because there is that huge connection with histamine. When estrogen's high, histamine raises as well. So especially anyone who's dealing with cyclical symptoms, things get worse around ovulation and pre-period. The times where estrogen's the highest, they could have issues with histamine as well. So it's something to look further into, definitely. And I always end my episodes with a few more questions for my guests. So the first one is, what's something that you do every day to stay in hormonal harmony?
I always make it a point to have an herbal tea.
Okay. And my second question, this might tie in, is what's one food, herb, or supplement that you couldn't live without?
You know, I think broccoli. I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty basic, but it's so powerful in so many ways.
Yeah.
What's your go-to breakfast?
PFF kind of breakfast. So I have breakfast a little bit later in the day, like at about 10:30, 11. So I do like a form of intermittent fasting, but without any caffeine. And it will typically be a piece of protein, heaps of vegetables. Because we're in winter right now, when we're recording this, you know, we something like steamed broccolini or collard greens or broccoli with some nice dressing, and a piece of sweet potato maybe, just to make me feel a little bit fuller. A lot of nuts and seeds on top of it. So that will be my go-to breakfast. I will say, you know, whenever I travel, I'll have a breakfast because sometimes you just have no choice, especially being in America. You know, the best breakfast you can find is oats, right? And then it comes with like a load of, you know, stuff on top of it that's all super sweet. And that's the only breakfast you can have. And that's gluten-free too. And I will say it's like 11 o'clock, you know, so if I eat that breakfast at 8, by 11 o'clock, I want to have caffeine. I'm tired. My brain I'm brain dead. I got brain fog going on. You know, so it's something that I like always pay the price for it. So, you know, and I've traveled to over 40 different countries, and let me tell you, the more developed countries you go to, they never ever eat sugar for breakfast. It's always savory. If you go to Japan, it's savory. You go to Turkey, it's savory breakfast. You know, you go to Ethiopia, Peru, go to the markets in the morning. They always have like soups and such. It's always savory food. So that's my absolute go-to. And having grown up in Asia is just so ingrained in me that having, you know, a toast with jam on it is just absolutely, it just feels like a punishment.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? People look at me so strange when I have like a pork chop for breakfast. But it's, yeah, just one of those things. People have broth and soup for breakfast. It doesn't have to be the traditional orange juice and cereal and pancakes and waffles. That's obviously not helping the population, because those countries who do that are often the fattest and the sickest. Yeah. And very last question is, where can people find more from you online and grab your book? So you have the new book, Overcoming Estrogen Dominance, and you very kindly allowed us to do a giveaway. So I'm going to do that this week on my Instagram page when this episode's been released. And you have another great book as well that I share all the time with my clients with the hormone kind of balancing recipes. Tell us a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, so it's so the latest book, as you said, is Overcoming Estrogen Dominance, and it's addressed specifically for all the various symptoms of estrogen dominance, including various protocols for, like, if you have lumpy breast, endometriosis, fibroids, and there's like about 20 different protocols that are in there. The first book that came out 3 years ago that you're referencing is called Cooking for Hormone Balance, and so that's a little bit more broader. That estrogen dominance is a part of it, but it also covers hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, menopause, PCOS, as some of the conditions.
Yeah, both really great resources. And I'm also going to link some freebies that your team have linked to in the show notes. So there's a hormone quiz, a superfoods list, and a free recipes download as well. So they'll all be attached. So thank you so much, Magdalena. This has been amazing. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. And I know there's going to be a ton of women who are going to benefit from this information.
I really appreciate you having me here and spreading the word about estrogen dominance. Thank you.